So I'll go ahead and introduce myself to everybody. So my name is Miss McGuire. So I am a Manatee Master here at Manatee Lagoon. I've actually been here since we opened back in 2016. So Manatee Lagoon is actually celebrating its 5th year anniversary this week with our virtual Manatee Fest. It's kind of cool to see. So I want to welcome you all to the Marine Science Series. So again, my name is Miss McGuire. I'm an educator here at Manatee Lagoon, and we're all super excited to start this adventure with you guys to learn all about the fascinating world of marine science. So essentially this series is brought to you by Manatee Lagoon as well as the Reef Institute. So Manatee Lagoon is located in Riviera Beach. This is a destination typically where people can see wild manatees, and we educate about manatees as well as the environment around our center. So now the Reef Institute is located in West Palm, and they're dedicated to the coral reef conservation through education, research, as well as restoration. So essentially I'm going to be introducing you to kind of what you can expect over the next few weeks. So our goal is essentially to kind of take a deep dive into the world of marine science. We're going to explore how living organisms such as manatees and coral reefs are kind of all connected. So each week, our lesson is going to be led by an educator like myself from either Manatee Lagoon or the Reef Institute. We're going to be teaching about a new topic each week. So are you guys excited and ready to learn about all of these fun marine science things? And you guys are going to be a marine scientist along with me. So yeah, awesome. Let's get started. So this week we're going to kind of start things off by going over what is marine science. So kind of just like a brief overview, kind of, what are we studying? What are we learning about? What does marine science encompass, right? So my first question to you is, and you can raise your hand if you want to answer, and I can call on you. You can unmute yourself and kind of give me the answer if that's easier for you guys. So I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think a scientist is? What does a scientist do? What is a scientist? So you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Sydney, do you want to answer?
It's like a discovery, somebody that discovers something and finds out if it explodes or not.
Right, yeah. So yeah, they discover something, right? They're going to be studying it. So a scientist, yep, you're right. Does anybody else want to add to that? What is a scientist? What does a scientist do?
Someone that solves problems.
Someone that solves problems. Yep, that's a great one. Anybody else? You can always like type them into the chat too if you want, if that's easier for you. Or you can just chime in. What is a scientist? What do they do on a daily basis? What does that entail? And I'm just saying scientist, right? That can encompass a lot of different things, right? A scientist can encompass biology, chemistry, environmental science, marine science, everything, right? Someone who studies how the world works. Yeah, so there's even that, right? That's a super broad look at what a scientist does. So essentially, scientists are somebody, right? They figure things out that exist in the world. Yeah, exactly, right? They kind of discover new species all the time, right? And new species are constantly popping up. And even recently, they've discovered new species of whales. It's kind of crazy to think that we can discover new species that are that big. So it's really cool to think about. And the awesome thing about the ocean too is that it's so big and so vast that we can discover new species on a daily basis and multiple species on a daily basis. It's just really kind of cool to think about that. That's how big our oceans are, that we don't know everything about them. We know more about the space, out on the moon and things like that than we do our own oceans. So it's kind of cool to think about. But yeah, so a scientist is somebody who observes, they collect data, they investigate questions, right? So they can run experiments. They can even study space, that's right. Yeah, so a scientist is just a very broad overview. Now I want to ask you guys, what is a marine scientist? What do you think a marine scientist is?
Someone who studies the ocean.
Someone who studies the ocean? Yep, that's right. Somebody who studies the ocean. Sydney, did you want to chime in?
Someone who preserves the ocean and finds out what can be in it.
Right, yeah, someone who preserves the ocean.
Like
yeah.
What kind of different coral can burn you, or which one can, like, creatures live inside.
Yeah, that's exactly right? We're constantly learning about the animals that are in the ocean and what they can do, their effects even on humans, right? So a marine scientist is essentially kind of the same thing as a scientist, all relates to the ocean, right? So marine scientists can study things like rocks on the bottom of the ocean floor. They can study things like microscopic organisms that are swimming around, like plankton and zooplankton. They can study dolphins and manatees, coral reefs, right? So they can study all these different types of things that all relates to the ocean. They could even study seabirds, right? Seabirds that are living along the shoreline of our oceans. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Kind of the importance of coral reefs and their role that they play in the ocean. So my first question, kind of along our corals, I'm going to ask you guys, what is this? Kind of already gave it to you. You guys can shout it out, type it in the chat.
It's a coral.
Coral, right? Yeah, this is what we're kind of talking about today. So this is no longer living coral, right? This is coral skeletons. So these have been dead for quite some time. So this is just kind of what's left over from corals when they die. So I'll show you a couple of pictures here. So this is a good picture of kind of what a live coral would look like close up. So we've got that, and then I'll show you another picture of a coral. So they all look different too. They can be different colors, different sizes. So then when you look at all these corals from afar, we have something like this, coral reef, right? This is a great picture of what a coral reef might look like. And we're going to be talking about the importance. Before we kind of get into the importance of coral reefs, or kind of what a coral really is, I want to talk about more broadly the ocean in general and kind of the earth and what it's made up of, right? So the activity I'm going to kind of show you guys today, you can do with just a single piece of paper, or you can have a blue piece of paper and a brown piece of paper. So you can kind of get those. I'll give you a couple seconds to kind of get your materials ready, but you can use just a simple white piece of paper and a marker, and you can draw a line. But yeah, make sure you have like a marker, pen, pencil, whatever you want to draw with. And either blue or brown piece of paper or just a simple white piece of paper will do. And I'll kind of explain how to use the white piece of paper as I go on. So essentially what our pieces of paper are representing, the blue is representing water, right? So water. And then our brown piece of paper is representing land. So when we're talking about the earth, we're going to be talking about water and land, right? So when you think about it, earth is made up of 70% of water. 70% of the earth is water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my blue sheet of paper over top of the brown sheet and leave just a little bit of the brown on the side. So about 30% of our earth is covered by land and 70% is covered by water. Now, if you have a piece of paper, just a white sheet of paper, you can draw like a line along the bottom here and leave a little bit of space on the bottom, and that'll represent your land. And up here will represent your water. So that's what you can do if you have a piece of paper. So essentially what I'm doing here is just showing you kind of the composition of the earth. So 70% water, 30% land. Now of this 70% here, all of this water, do you guys think, you can show me with your hands, do you guys think there's a lot of salt water or only a little bit of salt water? What do you guys think? A lot of salt water or a little bit of salt water? I see some of you, a lot of salt water, right? So 97% of all the water found on Earth is actually in our oceans. It's salt water. So 97% of all the water on Earth are found in our oceans. That's a lot in our oceans, right? Only 3% is actually freshwater. And our freshwater can come from our lakes, rivers, like streams and ponds and glaciers, right? So it's not just our oceans that are on Earth, but only 3% of that is actually freshwater. It's kind of cool to think about. So that is a lot of salt water, you're right. So essentially within our ocean, so we have 97% of that water is our ocean. I want you guys to think about how much coral do you think is found in the ocean? And what I want you to do is I want you to take a marker and I want you to draw a circle on your piece of paper. How much do you think is in the ocean? You can draw a big circle. You can draw a little circle, you can draw a medium-sized circle. So I'll show you, you can pick either or, you can draw whatever size circles you want. Just kind of guess how much coral do you think is found in the ocean? So go ahead and write that down. Now what I want you to do is I want you to take your piece of paper and flip it over. So go ahead and flip it over so it's blank again. And I'm actually going to kind of show you how much coral is actually in the ocean. So I'm going to draw a box on my piece of paper. And I'm going to come closer so you guys can. That is representing my coral. 1% of the ocean floor is covered by coral reef. So only 1% of the ocean is covered by coral reef. That's crazy to think about, right? Coral reef covers 1% of the ocean floor. Yet we think about coral reefs, you know, there's big reefs out there. Then we also think about, we have to think about how big are our oceans. Our oceans are really, really big. So it's really cool to think about. Now, within that box, I want you to go ahead and color in one corner of it. So I'll show you up close so you can see what that looks like. Corner within that box. So remember, 1% of our ocean floor is covered by coral reefs. Now within that 1%, 25% of all marine life found in the ocean live on coral reefs. That is so crazy to think about, that a quarter of all marine life found in the entire ocean, and all the oceans, live on only 1% of the area in the ocean. That's so crazy to think about, right? So why do you guys think coral reefs are important, right? So they have a lot of diversity. They have a lot of different species. Why do you think coral reefs are so important? Why should we care about coral reefs? What do you guys think? Type into the chat. You can kind of raise your hand. I can call on you. What do you guys think? Why do you think they're so important? Any takers? I'll give you a couple seconds to type in the chat. Coral reefs cover 1% of the ocean floor, yet they have 25%. Because fish live in them, right? So there's a lot of fish that live in there. Sydney, do you want to take a guess?
It's because if we pull out a piece of coral, all the coral in the world would kind of die.
Right, there's not very much, right? So we want to protect the amount that we have there, right? Because coral is living. I see coral's living, right? So coral's important. Yes, it's a living animal. But also we were talking about 25% of all life in the ocean is found there. So it's kind of crazy to think about, you know, our corals must provide a lot of different things for all these animals, right? So it's a habitat for marine life. You're exactly right. So coral is a habitat for a lot of marine life. They provide structure, they provide protection, they even provide food, right? Because if you have a big fish living on a coral reef, you have a small fish as well, right? So we've got tiny fish, big fish, we have plants, all these different things living along coral reefs. And we have this whole ecosystem there. So everything is kind of thriving on each other. And we'll be talking more about ecosystems later on, but it's just cool to think about how important, you know, these coral reefs are in the grand scheme of things, what they're providing to the ocean. So it's just kind of funny to think about. How does your picture on the back, how does that compare to our little tiny box on the front, right? Did any of you put like a really big circle? Maybe some of you put like a medium-sized circle, and maybe some of you put a really small circle, and maybe you were right? So it's kind of fun to think about. Now, take your marker, and I want you to go ahead and put 15 dots of different sizes all over your blue paper. There's a bunch of dots, 15 dots, different sizes. Maybe you can do like little squares, you can do a couple little shapes here and there, different sizes all around your paper. Essentially what that's representing is all the other marine life found in the ocean. So if you think about a coral reef, I'll kind of connect it to what a city would be like. Does anybody here live in an apartment complex? There's a lot of people living nearby, right? Yeah. So coral reefs are kind of like a big city. There's a lot of action. There's a lot of organisms or people, you know, running around, or cars driving around, right? A city is very busy. You have a lot of different things that live there. Now, if you think about if you're driving along the highway in the middle of the state, do you think that's going to be super busy, or do you think it's probably going to be kind of empty? Probably kind of empty, right? Yeah, empty. So essentially, you might be driving, you might find a rest stop here and there, a couple of restaurants along the way. But if you're driving along the highway, you're not in those big cities. So there's pretty empty. So the rest of the ocean is actually fairly empty compared to a coral reef. So we have our coral reefs that are really busy, that have a lot of marine life. And then we have the rest of our oceans that are fairly empty compared to, what our coral reef kind of looks like. So it's really interesting to think of. And, our coral reefs are really important, not only for the animals that live there, but they're important for us too, right? Because we might like to swim around a coral reef. Maybe, coral reefs are right along our coastline. And we'll talk about the importance of coral reefs when it comes to our coastlines and things like that later on. But it's kind of cool to think about all the animals that live along coral reefs, can include microscopic organisms that you can't see, then really, really big organisms like, dolphins, whales, and sharks, and maybe even a manatee might be swimming past a coral reef, right? So it's really, really cool to think about. Plankton, yes, you can find plankton along coral reefs and things like that. There's actually an organism called zooplankton that live inside of corals. We'll talk about that a little later because we're going to get more into specifically what corals are and kind of their importance as individual animals, and then as well as like colonies and coral reefs. So it's kind of about that, a single polyp would be a little animal, and then a bunch of those would be a colony, and then a coral reef all live together. So it's kind of cool to think about. There's a lot of different things that live on coral reefs, and there's a lot of different relationships that can be found on coral reefs. So we will, definitely talk about the importance of those later on in other sessions. Next week, we're actually going to be talking about what is a hypothesis. How do you form a hypothesis? How do you answer questions related to a hypothesis and things like that? So it's going to be really fun to think about. And a lot of our, lessons are going to be very marine science related, right? We're going to be thinking like scientists. And can you guys remind me what a marine scientist is? Anyone want to remind me? I'm going to probably ask you this again next.
It's someone who discovers like things in the ocean and studies the animals and plants in the ocean.
Right, yeah, somebody who studies the animals, the plants, and the ocean, right? Anything related to the ocean. And that can include more than just plants and animals. It can be things like sand and mud and rocks that are along the bottom of the ocean floor, right? Even just like the movement of water in the ocean, so waves and currents and things like that. All of that is included in marine science. Even studying birds that live along the coastline, or areas that are affected by the ocean, or even weather patterns related to ocean effects and things like that. So marine science is a really big realm of things, right? You can get more specific in marine science if you're talking about plants and animals. That might be more like marine biology, right? So there can be marine biology, marine geology, right? Studying rocks and things like that, or even like oceanography and things like that. So it's really cool to think about how marine science encompasses a lot of different things. And today what we focused on was the importance of coral reefs, just because a lot of the marine life found in the ocean are found along these really small areas of the ocean. And it's kind of fun to think about that, such a small area in the ocean can have that much life there. It's kind of crazy to think about that, all that could fit in one spot. And, sometimes I like to think about it like our outflow here at Manatee Lagoon is a really small little pocket area, but we have hundreds of manatees that come in form, and they just kind of pack into themselves. And you might think, oh, I think only about 50 manatees could fit in there, but sometimes we have over 300 manatees getting warm. So it's cool to think about how much life can really go into a small area. And they all depend on those things too, right? So everything kind of has a relationship with one another. So I want to open it up to you guys. If you guys have any questions, comments, raise your hand. Those of you that I can see, raise your hand if you've ever seen a coral reef. Have you ever seen a coral reef, or maybe a coral in a tank? You've seen a reef tank before, right? We actually have a coral reef tank here at Manatee Lagoon. It's pretty cool. We've got some fish, lots of corals. Yep. So I see some people in the chat are like me. I've seen them. But yeah. And so it's really, really cool to think about. Now, do you guys have any questions as far as, questions about corals or coral reefs in general? Do you have any questions about marine science or kind of what we do here, or maybe even questions for me? You can type it into the chat, or you feel free to raise your hand. I can call on you. You can unmute yourself. Yeah, I'm sure you guys probably have lots of questions. I mean, there's lots of things to learn about that, we didn't discuss today. So like, if you think about, I had some people ask me, what is the biggest coral, the biggest species of coral? But do you guys want to know? Do you want me to tell you? Shake your head yes if you do. Yeah. Yeah, so the biggest species of coral is essentially called Big Mama. That is the name of the biggest coral. Big Mama is the biggest coral out there, and it's actually found down in the Bahamas. You can see it down in the Bahamas, so it's kind of cool to think about. And then what is the best school for marine biology? That was actually a really good question. So there's a lot of really cool places for marine biology, and there's not really like best schools, but any particular school that specializes or gives you a degree in marine biology or is located along a coastline that has a lot of interactive or field experience, it would probably be the best bet. Because if you're getting, if you go out into a lab and you get to go out actually onto the beach and study these things, it gives you more of a perspective. And I like that type of learning more than just sitting in the classroom and reading a book, right? You actually get hands-on experience. So those schools, I think, are some of the best. Is there an estimate on how many types of coral there are? That's a really good question. So there's hundreds of species of corals found throughout the world. And corals can live for a really, really long time. So corals actually take thousands of years to fully develop those big species of coral that you'll see, those big brain coral. And essentially you can look at these for thousands of years after they've been growing. They still last for thousands of years. So they can live for a really long time. Jack missed some of these. You can start at South Broward High School's Marine Biology Magnet program. That's really cool. And then can you show some animals? So I don't have any live animals here with me. I just have some kind of old skeletons of corals that you can kind of see in front of me. And then how deep is the ocean in meters? That's actually a really good question. So I don't know the exact depth, but it's thousands of meters deep. So the deepest portion would be if you look up the Mariana Trench. That is like some of the deepest parts of the ocean. And there's a lot of ocean too that has been undiscovered. So we may have more species of corals out there that we haven't even found yet. So it's kind of cool to think about. Sydney, did you have a question?
Baby manatees can almost be about 4 or 5 feet wide.
Right, so yeah, actually when they're born, they're about 3 to 4 feet long and 60 to 100 pounds. Kind of crazy to think about. Yeah, really big babies, right? What is the most common coral? So we have a lot of, so some of the most common coral that you'll see along reef structures would be hard coral. So your hard coral is actually what's making most of the reef. And then you do have some soft coral that's making parts of the reef, but most of your reef building corals are going to be these hard corals. They're going to be providing all that structure, so that's pretty common. So we have our hard and soft corals. The most uncommon coral, that's a really good question. I don't know. It's probably the most rare species. So the species that there's not a lot of, right? So they're really low in numbers. You could probably Google the rarest coral in the world, right? So maybe the most endangered. There are endangered species of coral, so they're in danger of becoming extinct, right? So one example of an extinct animal would be the dinosaurs, right? So there are lots of endangered species of corals, actually, unfortunately, because corals, are so important, but there's also so little of them, right? 1% of the ocean floor. So it's kind of crazy to think about how there really aren't a lot of corals out there in the grand scheme of looking at the whole ocean, right? So any other questions? I know we had a couple questions about manatees. Oh, are there underwater stations like the space station? That's a really good question. There actually are some underwater labs. Down in the Keys, there's actually an underwater lab that some of the researchers from Harbor Branch will actually go to. They'll go underwater and kind of work for a few days underwater in underwater labs. So it's really kind of fun to think about. I would love to do that. Or you can, there's also places mobile stations, so you can get on a submarine and do research, right? And they can go way deep down into the ocean. You can stay on those for days. But it's really cool to think about. You're right. Yeah, that is really cool. And then do fish fart? So fish do excrete, waste, right? So like poop and pee, but manatees are actually very widely known for their flatulence. Manatees do get really gassy. So it's kind of neat to think about. Manatees eat seagrass all day long. And if you think about it, they're called sea cow. And so and the cows eat grass all day, right? Cows eat grass a lot. So essentially manatees, they can actually fart quite a bit. They have bubbles that'll come up when they're swimming. It's kind of fun to think about. Of course, kids love that. Yeah, any other like coral related things, coral reef related things, or marine science? Any questions about that? I don't see anybody's hand raised. You could type it into the chat if you wanted. Yeah, there's a lot of things that can still be learned, right? Marine science is a really big field. So there's a lot of different things that we can still learn within the realm of marine science. And there's a lot of things being researched and asked all the questions. There's so many questions that you can ask. And there's never a dumb question, right? Every question is good, right? Because we never know if it's been answered or not, right? If you think it's a dumb question, you might not know. Actually, some people might not actually know the answer. So it's really cool. You always want to encourage as many questions as possible because there's so many things to study. But essentially next week, that's kind of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be forming questions and trying to answer questions kind of with an educated guess, right? A kind of a hypothesis. And that's what we're going to be learning about next week. But yeah, so let's see here. The uncommon coral has not been researched, right? Yeah, so there's probably a lot of corals that haven't really been researched. There's not a lot known of corals. Some species of corals haven't even been named yet. But yeah, so 12 types of coral are really rare. Yeah, I mean, there's probably lots of species of coral that are rare. Sydney, do you have a question?
Is it legal to take a piece of coral out of the ocean?
That's a really good question. So there are a lot of protected species of coral. So actually it is very illegal to take a piece of coral up from the ocean. And it also depends on which areas you're in because different states do different things, right? So there are different species of coral that are protected federally. So they're protected all across our country. So you can't even like take a tiny piece of it at all. Very similar to, how a lot of animals are protected, like manatees and dolphins and whales. It's actually illegal to interact with them as well. So yes, and it's always a best practice just to leave things in the water, right? We don't want to touch anything we don't know about. You never know if it might sting you, hurt you. You might actually hurt the organism if you touch it. So it's always best to kind of observe from a safe distance. And then let's see here. How old can manatees live to be? That's a really good question. So manatees, there was one in captivity that lived to be about 69. And then he died, but he actually died from an accident. So he got stuck in an underwater panel and he drowned. He didn't die of old age, so he might have gotten older. But typically in the wild, manatees get like 20s to 30s is pretty common just because they get hit by boats a lot. So unfortunately, boats, and they get cold really easily, so they can die of cold stress and things like that. They have a lot of threats to their survival. And then what is an interesting fact about coral? That's a really good question. So let me see here. I'm going to try and think about a fun fact about coral. So coral have a lot of different relationships. So one of their relationships is called a symbiotic relationship. And has anyone ever here seen Finding Nemo? Does anybody remember the animal or the fish that was kind of hiding in a little anemone, right? An anemone. Anemone is a type of coral, so they're kind of like a little polyp, right? So they kind of sit and they've got these tentacles. The fish can hide in the tentacles, so they have these symbiotic relationships with fish and shrimp and plankton and things like that. So it's really cool that they can be home to other animals as well, not just themselves. So yeah, Sydney, do you have another question?
What kind of disease can manatees get in the ocean?
That's a really good question. So we're going to be talking a lot more about manatees later on, but manatees, they can actually get sick from red tide. So red tide is a type of algae bloom, and they can get infected with toxins. It's actually called brevetoxin, and so they can get sick from that, and they can die, but they can also get other different types of like sicknesses, like respiratory illnesses and infections in their cuts from boat strikes and things like that. Yeah, these are all really good questions, and next week we're going to be talking a lot more about forming questions and answering them. But did you guys have fun today learning about marine science? Yeah, awesome. So next week we'll be talking a lot more about it as well, and so I will see you all next week, and I hope you guys had fun today and learned a lot. Yeah, thank you for letting